Well, you guys asked and I finally listened. Today we're going to make Briar Mead from Elder Scrolls Skyrim. Now if you played the game, you know the mead comes from a shady and wealthy business tycoon known as the Briar family. Now, I've always found it funny that even though it's the most expensive mead, it doesn't restore as many points as Honning Brew mead. Now in the game there are specifically two types of Briar mead. The regular one, and the more expensive Briar Reserve. Now, there isn't an official Briar Reserve recipe, so I figured I'd just go back to the Elder Scrolls official Briar Mead recipe and just make a fancier version of it. The recipe calls for crushed blackberries, dried rose hips, ground cloves, cinnamon, and a dash of salt. We'll save the dry ingredients for the post-fermentation stage, that way we can control the taste. Start with the berry version. I'm going to add blackberries to mine, then marionberries, then some boysenberries, some black raspberries, and even though they're not part of the blackberry family, I'm going to add black currants because they taste like blackberry. Instead of just using water, I'm going to use some blackberry sage tea to add some tannins early on. Hold on a second. Sorry, that music was starting to give me a headache. So as we wait for the water to boil, I'm going to weigh out all our honey. When fermenting, I typically use 3 pounds of honey per gallon. And since we're brewing 7 gallons, we're going to use 21 pounds of honey. Before we pitch the hot tea into the brew, I'm going to add some room temperature spring water to the batch. That way our tea can cool down and we don't fry our yeast in our boiling blackberry cauldron here. Now, for those of you in the comments who are worried that I'm going to get a cease and desist letter from Bethesda, you genuinely don't need to worry. None of this is being sold, and I'm just a home brewer who's got some sick dance moves. Now, since this is a big batch, I'm going to have my cousin help me out. And now that we've got the water to a rolling boil, we're going to add our tea bags. Now, I've been told American tea calls for 1 tea bag per cup, and since there's 2 gallons, we're going to use 32 tea bags for this brew. Once the tea's been made and it's time to remove the bag, we're going to throw it into a juicer real quick just to extract any bit of tea left. Now we can add the hot tea, which will make mixing the honey much easier so we can get the desired consistency much faster. After that, we'll clean and sanitize the same pot we used to make the tea to crush our berries. And since we're doing a fancier version of Briar Mead, I'm only crushing and juicing half the fruit, and then I'm throwing the other half directly into the must, which is just a fancy word for our mixture of honey, water, and fruit. The reason I'm throwing in half the fruit is so we can get those additional tannins from the berry skins. Using frozen fruit helps break down the cell walls, helping you extract as much juice as possible. Now let me tell you, this stuff stains worse than sin, so I suggest putting a towel down to soak up any berry blast that may or may not occur when adding our boiling berries to the must here. If help is available, use it. Nothing brings people together more than making Viking wine. Cherish the moment. Have a laugh with your cousin about how you look like the evil priest from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, crushing the heart of a mountainberry heathen. Excuse me, I apologize. Once you've acquired as much juice as possible from your fruit sack, go ahead and give everything a nice mix down before adding the remaining blackberry battalion to the batch. Now this technically is my 3rd batch of Skyrim mead, and after this I only have 1 flavor left, and type in the comments if you know which one. Now that we got our must made and mixed, it's time for my favorite part. Time to wake up the yeast and give them their morning shake. Yep. You could just throw away your old shake weight. After letting the yeast hydrate for about 20 minutes, I'm adding some fermented O and pectic enzyme to the yeast. The pectic enzyme will help break down all the fruit skins, and the fermented O contains all the nutrients that the yeast need throughout their fermentation journey. And yes, give everything one final mix down before we obtain our gravity reading. This measures our batch's sugar levels, so we can figure out how much sugar is going to be converted into alcohol. And as you can see, this batch is going to be 16.2, which is pretty high. And that's the final step. We're done. We can go ahead and seal up the batch and put a bubbler on top. Always make sure to store your mead somewhere room temperature in the dark. The yeast like their privacy when making alcohol. I'm using an EC1118 yeast, which actually is very strong and immediately started fermenting within just a few hours. Make sure to like and follow to see the whole process. It's been a full month of fermentation of our Briar Reserve mead from Elder Scrolls Skyrim, and now it's time to stabilize the dry wine. But before we rack it, I wanted to show you all the used up fruit. Now don't let the pink fool you, this mead is a dark violet. To avoid getting any leads or dead yeast in the jug, I'm using a hops basket to hold the siphon up and strain the mead that's being pulled in. Always make sure to wash your equipment with Be Bright and sanitize it with Star San. It's super cheap and it lasts you for a while. Well, depending on how much brewing you're doing. It's not exactly period accurate to whatever time period Skyrim is in, but it's guaranteed to protect your mead from any unwanted bacteria and microbes that are sure to ruin your mead. Even when we stabilize the batch and kill off all the yeast, we still want to ensure that everything is properly sanitized so we can protect all those desirable flavors. And once we get every last drop, it's time to add our Camden tablets. This pushes out all the oxygen so our mead doesn't oxidize. I always add 1 per gallon, and since this is 6 gallons, you guessed it, we're using 6. I'm using a meat tenderizer on a towel so I can pulverize the tablets into powder without waking up my sleeping roommate, and adding the powder to a mason jar and combining the crushed Camden with a little bit of mead, easily dispensed by our spigot, and giving it a nice shake to combine the mixture. Camden is notorious for getting clumpy, and it gets hard to mix with a skinny spatula in a 7-gallon jug. After 24 hours, we'll add 3 teaspoons of potassium sorbate. I actually forgot to get footage of this, so you'll have to trust I did it. And then after another 24 hours, we can at long last sweeten and spice our mead. But before we do, let's go ahead and taste our finished dry wine. Now, even though this fermented all the way down to 1.000, it still had a noticeable amount of sweet and fruity notes. I was really tempted to bottle some of it before I sweetened the batch, but I decided to save that method for my next Skyrim mead. Comment down below if you think you know which one. But now, I think it's time to reintroduce some honey into this dry mead. I'm using a 2-to-1 ratio of blackberry and raspberry honey from Hucklebee Farms. Always make sure to give everything a smell before adding it. Madam Maven Blackbriar would doubtfully approve of poor ingredients being added to her mead. That being said, since we're making a homemade version of Blackbriar Reserve, everything has to be a little fancier, as you'll see shortly with the ingredients we'll be adding. After giving everything a nice thorough mix, we can add a mesh bag made specifically for adding dry ingredients. Mine was made specifically for my jug, and the first thing we're going to add is 4 tablespoons of rose hips. They have a floral fragrance and apparently have a tart taste similar to cranberries or green apple. Next, cloves and star anise. Both taste like licorice, and I'm not a huge fan of these flavors, so I'm only adding 1.5 teaspoons of each. 1 stick of cassia bark cinnamon and 1 stick of Ceylon cinnamon. 1 whole Madagascar vanilla bean halved and sliced down the middle so all the insides are exposed. And finally, the last ingredient from the Elder Scrolls cookbook, salt. But not just any salt, pink Himalayan salt, because, well, I like the color. It's believed the Blackbriar family adds salt to their mead to keep their customers thirsty and always craving another cup. But here at Moonfire, we'd like to believe they did it to preserve the bold and savory taste this mead is known far and wide for. And after adding some oak chips and tartaric acid, we can bathe our spices in the berry blood, then bolt down our beloved brew to age for a couple of weeks. But be sure to reward your hard work with one final taste test. And I think this mead is shaping up to be one of my best. Immediately I could smell berries and vanilla with a hint of smokiness, but when I tasted it, it was just the right amount of sweetness. It has a nice emphasis on those winter flavors and just a touch of bitterness on the aftertaste. Make sure to like and follow so you can see the bottling and labeling process in a few weeks. Now that our Blackbriar Reserve mead has aged for a few weeks, it's time to bottle everything. After boisterously bathing our black bottles in Starcin, we can begin the battle of bottling up our beloved Blackbriar beverage. We decided to harvest the mead a couple of weeks earlier than I usually do. Now, this is because each of the flavors all have the perfect balance between one another, and I didn't want any of them to become more prominent than the other. Using a hand corker, we'll seal up the bottles with wine corks, and now all this mead has the potential to stay good for years to come. But before we leave these bottles somewhere dark and room temperature to age for a few years, let's add a few finishing touches to make these bottles go from amateur to professional. First, we'll add some wine seal capsules. And you can find these at any local homebrew shop or Amazon. Just make sure you have a heat gun to shrink wrap the seals. And now, the final touch for our Blackbriar Reserve mead, a professional wine label. Don't mind the hand, I'm sheltering a caveman from the CIA. Now, I found these printable wine labels on Amazon. They work pretty well, but I wouldn't say they're the most ideal. The ink tends to bleed if it gets wet, which will happen if you're pouring wine out of the bottle. If my fellow winemakers have any better suggestions, please leave them in the comments. But aside from having your mead name and brand label, make sure you include the fluid ounce and the alcohol by volume percentage, which we got at the beginning of this mead making process when we got a gravity reading, which was 16.2, in case you forgot. I always put a government warning because it looks professional, and so there's no mistakes about what it is. But here is the finished result, 30 bottles of Blackbriar Reserve. Make sure to like and follow to see more mead making videos.